Okay, we're back. Last time we talked about fish populations. Now we're going to build upon that. We're going to take multiple populations that all exist together and talk about the fish community. Specifically, we're going to talk about Homer Swingle and some of his pioneering work in this. So Homer Swingle is a name that you need to know. He's a very famous guy. He was down at Auburn in the 30s through the 50s. And he's one of the big names in fish management, especially farm pond fish management. Consequently, there's still a big fisheries program down there at Auburn, and this is why, because Homer Swingle started it. Now, initially he was an entomologist, and he was studying mosquito control in farm ponds. And then he eventually branched out into fisheries. So you think about this time, Dust Bowl, trying to convince people to build a lot of small ponds, and he was trying to deal with some of the problems coming up with those ponds like mosquitoes, but then he also realized that people were putting fish in there, and he got interested in the fish. Now, before Swingle came along, remember when we talked about the history of fish management? Early fish management was all about reproduction. It was all about, if we've got a problem with the fish, we need to build a hatchery and stock a bunch of fish there, and that'll solve it. Or we need to close the spawning season, or something like that. They thought that everything could be cured by stocking or protecting the spawn. And then Swingle, and around this time, Swingle and other people were starting to realize that actually over-reproduction is a big problem. When the fish are disappearing, that's a water quality problem. It's not, the fish are selected. They reproduce a lot. And in fact, if you're looking at it from an angling perspective, over-reproduction is a much more common problem. Too many small fish. And Swingle was one of the first people to really recognize this. Okay? Now, he also came up with the idea of balance in fish communities, which is an idea that persists today. And people still use this term balance. So what did Swingle mean by balance? He said that a fish community is in balance if, year after year, it yields fish in satisfactory amounts and size commensurate with the pond's fertility. Now that's a good definition for you to memorize because it's very important and it's used all the time. So balance is something that we want if we're managing our farm pond for our fisheries. We want to go out there every year and be able to catch the size of fish and the numbers of fish that are desirable for the angler. But of course that's commensurate with the fertility. So not all ponds are going to be able to produce large numbers of large fish. Now, how realistic is this? How realistic is it that you're going to have a pond that's going to kick out this quality fishery year after year? Not too realistic. In fact, Swingle was the guy to realize that about 8 in 10 ponds go out of balance within 2 years. So he had a whole bunch of experimental ponds, a whole bunch of ponds he was working with. He would stock them, then go back and drain them, use creel data, try to see which ones were in balance with his idea of balance. And he found that most of the time, in a very short period, these ponds would go out of balance. And of course, that's what we see today. Most of the time, we have over-reproduction. We've got a lot of small fish. And the reason that the ponds tend toward this, or one explanation is this is a lower energy state. So Dr. Heidinger used to tell me this. If you think about energy states and the laws of physics and the laws of nature, that the law of entropy says that things tend toward a lower energy state. Okay? And so if you've got things that are ordered, they will tend toward disorder. And if these ponds keep going toward this out of balance, if these ponds keep going toward this situation where you've got lots of small fish, that's probably because it's more efficient. It's a lower energy state, and systems tend to go toward their lower energy state. As with any energy state, if you want to maintain a high energy state, and so if balanced fish population is a high energy state, the only way to keep it at a high energy state is to add energy. Fundamental law of physics, right? Think about yourself. You're a very ordered, high energy state. Right? There's lots of things that are very coordinated, have to go right, but how do we maintain that? You have to eat every day. And so if the sun keeps pumping energy in and things capture that sunlight energy and we take in that energy, then we can maintain this higher ordered state, but we're constantly feeding energy into it. What happens if you stop eating and stop taking in energy? You wither and you die. You lose all this order, okay? So how do we add energy to a pond to keep it in balance at this high energy state? Active management. The things you do to manage that pond is energy. If you don't put that energy in, then it's going to tend to this low energy state, which is out of balance. And so this is essential to keeping the pond in balance. Realize that balance is a very anthropocentric term. Mother Nature doesn't care about what balance to Mother Nature is not balance to us. Mother Nature is going to tend toward that low energy state. Hey, lots of small fish. The fish don't care. They're selected to survive and reproduce and pass on their DNA, and this is the best way to do it for them from their point of view. But we don't want that. We want larger fish and larger numbers of fish, this idea of balance. And so the only way to maintain that high energy state is to put energy into the system. Stocking, weed control, harvesting, just measuring the population. Now, I think this is something to understand, and because a lot of people think that you can find the magic bullet. A lot of people think that if you just get the right initial stocking rate, then the pond will take care of itself. It'll stay in balance if we just get that right initial stocking state. The initial stocking state is important. It helps to set the stage, but it's the energy you put in after stocking that is most likely to determine whether this pond stays in balance. And you've got to convince people of that they're just not going to be able to throw in the right number of bass and bluegill and then go out and catch the fish that they want year after year without doing anything else. To have a good pond takes energy. The nice thing is it's fun energy. It's usually not a whole lot of work. Okay. So why do so many ponds go out of balance? What causes these ponds to go out of balance and to shift toward this low energy state? Well, these are pretty much in order from most important to least. Over-reproduction, we said, is probably the most important thing. There's just so many fish in there, they start to crowd out, and then you get a lot of small fish, which is not acceptable to the angler. Over-harvest, of course, can also knock your pond out of balance. If you're taking too many of the large fish, then there can't be large fish in any number in there, and that's also not in balance. Putting in the wrong species. So if you stock a green sunfish or a crappie, okay, these things are going to reproduce like crazy, they're not very vulnerable, your pond's out of balance. Too little or too much watershed, okay? The watershed is going to affect fertility and siltation, also the amount of water coming into the pond. So usually you don't have a choice of how much watershed you have. The best place to build a pond is where you can build a pond, okay? You kind of just take what watershed you can get. But if you got too little watershed, dry years, the pond might dry up. You might not have enough water coming in, and you might not have very many nutrients coming in. Most of the time, too much watershed is the problem. If you have a heavy rain, you might have so much water coming through, you might bust out the dam. That's not very likely. But you're going to definitely have lots of siltation and lots of nutrients coming in if your watershed is too big, and that can ultimately lead to imbalance. Rule of thumb, 10 to 20 acres of forested watershed per surface acre of water. Now, if you're looking at a pasture, it's more like 5 to 10 acres of pasture. Of course, the forest is going to lock up the nutrients, lock up the soil, so you can get by with a bigger watershed. Pasture, you don't need as much. Now around here in western Illinois, of course, a lot of your watershed's agriculture. I don't know of any rule of thumb for agriculture, but I'm betting it's going to be not much more than 5, right? A row crop is going to put in a lot of nutrients into your pond and a lot of siltation. And so you probably want a pretty small watershed for your pond. Fish going over the spillway can lead the pond to be out of balance. I saw this at my dad's pond once. He had a big rain. We went down below the dam, and there's thousands of tiny bass. Most people aren't going to put in any kind of a fish fence or a fish barrier in their spillway, and so you have the potential to lose a lot of fish. Probably not all that common in a farm pond. A summer or winter kill is also going to throw your pond out of balance. You hear this all the time. I have this great pond, and all of a sudden I got nothing, right? I mean, if you kill 90% of the fish, then the ones that live, maybe a few bluegill, you're going to have this tremendous spawn. You're going to have tons and tons of bluegill, no predators. You can see how a summer or winter kill can very quickly throw a pond out of balance. Realize that in real life, usually several of these are in effect at once. And so if you've got all this going on, you can see why ponds tend to go out of balance very quickly. Every once in a while, you get that magic pond that will stay in balance for a long time without any energy going into it. But I'm telling you, it's not very common. Okay, so Homer Swingle was looking for balance. This is what he wanted out of his ponds. And he was trying to figure out, how can I determine which ponds are in balance, or how can I determine what's going to indicate to me if these ponds are in balance or if they're heading out of balance, and how can I understand this? So he had lots of ponds that he stocked. Within 2 years, 80 to 90% of them were out of balance. He used creel data to define balance, because balance is based upon what the angler wants. So then he went to these ponds, and he knew whether or not it was in balance or not. So he drained them and measured all the fish. Every fish in that pond, he got the length and the weight on. And then he looked at those data. He was trying to predict and measure pond balance based upon these. So he's wanted to figure out, what can I measure in a pond to tell me if it's in balance without having to rely upon creel data, right? Because creel data is unreliable, spotty. I need to be able to go out to a pond, measure the fish, and decide if this pond is in balance. And if it's not in balance, I need a way to measure as I'm working on the pond whether I'm putting it in balance. So he had all this data. He did all kinds of combinations, looked at all different ways, and of all the things he came up with, 3 indices seemed to work best. And he called the 3 best ones he had were the F to C ratio, the Y to C ratio, and the A sub T ratio. And so we'll talk about each of these. And we'll also realize how a lot of the stuff we do today could be traced directly back to what Swingle did here. Okay, first one is called the F to C ratio. That's the weight of all forage fish divided by the weight of all carnivore fish. And so how many kilograms of forage do you have for each kilogram of carnivore, right? And when he compared this to his ponds that were in balance and out of balance, he said a desirable range is about 3 to 6. Ponds that were in balance had a little bit wider range, about 1.5 to 10. And the ponds that were unbalanced had this tremendous range. They range from less than 1 F to C ratio all the way up to 65. So you see the tremendous upper range in the unbalanced ponds. And so these ponds had, 65 F to C ratio means for every kilogram of carnivore, you got 65 kilograms of forage. You can see how that could be a very imbalanced, crowded pond. How did he decide what was a forage fish and what was a carnivore fish? Just did it by species. Okay, bluegill is always forage, no matter what its size. Largemouth bass, always a carnivore, no matter what its size. So an 8-inch bluegill was considered forage. Maybe not. A 4-inch largemouth, always considered a carnivore. Maybe not, right? So that's kind of one of the drawbacks to this F to C ratio, is that it's not very precise in definition of forage and carnivore. Now, if you also look at this ratio, maybe you see another problem here. Another problem is if you look at the ranges and you see there's lots of overlap, right? And so it's not very clear what's going to be an unbalanced pond and a balanced pond. If you had an F to C ratio of 5, well, that's desirable. but you also had some unbalanced ponds that had that ratio. So it was a good idea, but wasn't terribly practical because it had a lot of overlap. Now, from this ratio, we actually can trace something that we do today directly to this ratio. Let me just show you this real quick. Let's say you want an F-to-C ratio of 4, which is right in that butter zone that Swingle defined, okay? And we're going to stock a pond to get this ratio. Let's assume the pond carrying capacity is 100 pounds per acre, all right? So we need to divide that 100 pounds into 80 pounds of bluegill and 20 pounds of largemouth bass. And if we had that divided in that way, we're going to have our F-to-C of 4, and that would indicate a desirable range, and that's likely to be a balanced population. So for every pound of bass, you've got 4 pounds of bluegill. All right? So we're going to stock this pond. We'll assume that the average weight of a bluegill is about 1/4 pound. So that means we need 320 bluegills to get the 80 pounds of bluegill that we're shooting for. However, we're only going to get 70% survival when we stock those fish. Okay? So we'll need to stock 457 bluegills. Each one's about 1/4 pound. Only 70% of them will survive. That'll leave 320 bluegills. Each one's 1/4 pound. That gives us the 80 pounds total bluegill. By the same logic, if the average weight of a bass is about 1 pound, we'll need to stock 29 largemouth. 29 largemouth, 70% survival will give us our 20 fish, and 1 pound each gives us our 20 pounds. Okay? Now, actually, the real carrying capacity of a pond is probably closer to 300 pounds per acre. So let's take those values we just calculated and multiply by 3. That's going to give us 1371 bluegill per acre and about 87 bluegill per acre to ultimately get our F-to-C ratio of 4. Let's go ahead and round those off then. 1,500 bluegill per acre, 100 largemouth per acre. And that is a rule of thumb that is used even today for stocking a new pond. This is a fertile pond. 300 pounds per acre is kind of a fertile pond. And so if you hear, hey, 1,500 bluegill per acre and 100 largemouth bass per acre, that's not just some number that was pulled out of the air or somewhere else. That's a number that is based upon this work that Swingle did, and it's based upon his F-to-C ratio. Okay. Now, we noticed there were some problems with the F-to-C ratio. Some of those problems are solved by looking at his Y-to-C ratio. The Y-to-C ratio is the weight of vulnerable forage divided by the weight of carnivores, okay? So now the smaller bluegill are forage, but the bigger bluegill are not. I don't think the bigger bluegill are counted as carnivores, they're just not forage, right? And the smaller bass are counted as forage now, not as carnivores, okay? So we're getting a little bit more precise with this Y-to-C ratio. Now, there's no hard and fast rule for determining who is vulnerable. There's no cutoff point, but you get the idea that we're trying to be a little bit more precise, and we see that the ranges we get with this ratio are a little bit tighter. Desirable Y-to-C ratio is about 1 to 3. The ponds that were in balance were from 0 to 5, so that's tighter. But we still have some overlap. The unbalanced ponds had a range of 0.5 up to 15. So you still see that same pattern where you've got this really high upper end. So the ponds that have lots of vulnerable forage per kilogram of carnivore are likely to be unbalanced. And there's still overlap. So this is a better ratio, but still not the best. The best that he came up with was the A sub T ratio. Okay? A sub T is the weight of harvestable fish divided by the total weight of fish. So now we're not talking about predator-prey. We're not talking about forage-carnivore. Okay? We're talking about, of all the fish in the pond, the biomass of fish in the pond, how much of that biomass is considered a harvestable fish. And this was his best ratio for predicting balance. Okay? It's the percent of the community that is going to be harvestable, or the percent of the biomass of the community. And he found that a desirable range was about 60 to 80%. Ponds that were in balance were about 35 to 90%. And then the unbalanced ponds were about 0.5% up to 39. So there's a lot less overlap with this index, and that's why it works so well. So imagine a pond that's got 30% of the community is harvestable. That's not a balanced pond, right? There's 70% of the pond, of the fish in there, the biomass of the fish is not going to be acceptable to the angler. Whereas if you've got something like 70 to 80% of the biomass is harvestable, that's what we're shooting for. You can also have too high of an A sub T ratio. So anything from 80 to 90, you've got lots and lots of big fish, which sounds great, but that's not going to be in balance. You're not going to be able to keep that up year after year because there's not enough for those big fish to eat. All right? So now we're talking about the percentage of fish that are harvestable or the percentage of fish that are quality. Does that sound like anything else that we've talked about in this class? I think it does. That sounds like the PSD, right? The PSD is talking about the percentage of stock fish that are also quality fish. And it sounds a lot like this A sub T ratio because this is where the PSD grew out of, okay? So the A sub T ratio is good, and it was the best one Swingle came up with, but then it was improved upon and turned in, and when we created the PSD, and that's why we use PSD today. So the person who came up with this idea of PSD that we talked about last time is Dick Anderson, and he was with the Missouri Department of Conservation, another famous name you need to know. He came up with PSD. He did a lot of work with crappie. He was in kind of the 70s, I think was his era, 70s and 80s. And so he modified the A sub T to come up with the PSD. And so why is the PSD considered superior, and then why is it the one that we use today? A big advantage is that it uses length, not weight, okay? And that makes it a better index. There's less variability in length. Remember when we talked about relative weights? We said for a given length of fish, there's a range in weights, right? You can have a very skinny fish, a very plump fish. So there's lots of variability in weight, less variability in length. So if we use length for our index, then we've got more precision, okay? Another advantage to length, it's easier to measure. Think about throwing a fish down on a bump board versus getting that fish to sit still in a scale, and the fish is flopping and the boat is moving around. So it's just easier to measure length. Of course, that's why another reason why there's more variability in fish weight, just because it's harder to measure a fish, the weight of a fish. A real big advantage here is you don't have to drain the entire pond and kill all the fish. Remember that Swingle's indices were based upon the weight of all fish. And so Swingle's indices would tell you what you had, but of course not what you don't have any pond after you're done getting Swingle's index. Clearly that's not very advantageous. Whereas with the PSD, you can just take a sample of fish, take their length, throw them back in, and still get information which allows you to calculate balance. As we said before, the PSD is advantageous because it only looks at the stock fish or the catchable fish. It ignores the many small young of the year fish. Remember, there's lots of variability in year class strength. There's lots of variability. There's lots of these small fish. All of these small fish go into Swingle's calculations and add variability to his calculations, but the PSD avoids those. So that makes it advantageous. And that's why we use PSD today when we're evaluating our fish populations and communities. So the PSD is applied to a population, but we're talking about a community. How do we use the PSD for the community? Well, we just calculate the PSD for the different populations and then look at our ranges and compare them and see if we're in balance. So there are different people have different recommendations here, but these seem to be the ones that come up most often. If you've got the bluegill PSD in the 20 to 40 range and the largemouth PSD in the 40 to 70 range, that usually indicates a pond that's in balance, okay? And a nice way to visualize this is to create what's known as a tic-tac-toe graph, okay? So you see that we've got the largemouth PSD on the x-axis, the bluegill PSD on the y-axis. We've got our 20 to 40 bluegill range marked and our 40 to 70 largemouth range marked. And so once you have this graph and you go out and take a sample from your pond, you'll calculate the bluegill and the largemouth PSD for that pond, and you'll plot it on this graph, and you want your pond to fall in this range. So it's another advantage of using these indices is it gives you a goal. You can say my goal is to have this pond fall within this shaded area on this tic-tac-toe graph, and so I can apply my management tools to try and get toward that goal. If you're not in the shaded range, then you can consider the pond to be out of balance. Now, remember, this idea of balance is that you're going to get the size and number of fish that the angler wants year after year commensurate with the fish's fertility. So this will tell you if your pond is in balance, but remember that balance is a high energy state. And so it doesn't mean that your pond is going to stay in this shaded area. It just means it's in the area that you want. And if you can keep your pond to where it's in this shaded area, then the anglers are going to be happy. They're going to catch fish that they want every year. So if you went and took a sample and your pond was in this quadrant, what would that be like? How would you describe this pond? Well, you see that you've got a low largemouth PSD and a high bluegill PSD. And so you've got bigger bluegill, but small largemouth, right? So now if this is being managed for a bluegill fishery, this might be something that you want, but it's probably not something that the angler is looking for. Now, again, remember with PSD, you also need to know catch per unit of effort or density. You need to have some idea of the numbers of fish. And so here you might have, larger bluegill and smaller bass, but you don't know what, you might not have many bluegill. So you might be getting fish of the size the angler wants, but not in the numbers, right? And this might not be something that's going to keep up for year after year because you've got too many small bass and not enough small bluegill, and so the bluegill might not be reducing. There's lots of explanations for this. The point is that a pond that fell in this quadrant would have large bluegill, small largemouth, but it would not likely produce the fish that the angler wants year after year. Well, what do you have with this pond? With this pond, of course, you have the opposite. You've got large bass structure, but lots of small bluegill. This is your classic, probably over-reproduction. You've got so many small bluegill. And again, we don't know the density of either one of these species, but you can imagine that this would not produce the fish you want. You say, well, I've got large bass, which the angler wants, but you probably don't have the numbers of the large bass that you want. And you're not going to be able to keep this up year after year because all those small bluegill, they're going to eat the bass eggs and limit largemouth reproduction, perhaps. They're going to compete with the small bass for food, so the bass aren't going to grow well, and so you might see if you measure this pond every year, you might see that point move around to where you end up with smaller bluegill and smaller bass. But again, it's not in the goal, which is where you've got fish that the angler wants in the size and the numbers. Okay, what about this pond? This pond is a dream, right? This is what everybody wants. This is the pond that everybody wants. We've got big bass and big bluegill, and I want a lot of them, right? And as a fish manager, you have to convince people that this is probably not going to happen, okay? This is just not enough forage to keep those bass, large bass, fed. You've got this large number of bluegill. Who knows what's going to happen here? We don't know the numbers of each of these, but this is probably not very likely, and it's not very sustainable. Now, you might do something like feed the pond and help to keep the bass big and the bluegill big, but if you stop feeding them, then it's just not going to sustain itself at any rate. You've got some bigger fish, but do you have the numbers of those fish, and will you be able to keep those fish big year after year? Probably not. Realize that these graphs are not going to tell you everything, but by using this graph, you can sort of visualize what you've got and, more importantly, where you need to be. And so then you can structure your management scheme around that. Now, I don't have anything to back this up other than my experience and my feeling is that most likely you're going to run into a pond. If a pond's not in balance, it's going to be in one of these three quadrants, right? This is the low energy state that you're going to tend toward, where you've got smallish bluegill and smallish bass. And this is going to probably persist year after year, right? This is just a pond that's out of balance, and it just does not have the fish that the angler wants in the numbers that they want. And so you're going to need to do something to try to push this pond into that shaded area. But again, once it's in the shaded area, it's not likely to just stay there unless you put a little energy into it, okay? So anyway, that's Swingle and Anderson, and now we're starting to use some of these indices to understand our fish community. And in the future lectures, we're going to talk about how to use these indices and try to come up with some management schemes to try to get the pond that we want, get that pond in balance. So that's all I've got. Thanks a lot. Have a good one, and I will talk to you later. See ya.